Hello, I'm Benjamin Miss, and this is Introduction to Psychology, Emotion. Well, let's start by asking a question. Why are you either in this class or learning this material? What's your motivation? Do you like learning? Are grades important to you? And why do you want to do well? Well, we generally think of motivation as a component of our emotional state, right? Like what's driving us, especially when we think of positive psychology. Well, different people have different definitions of success, and this is an older study that still seems pretty true for our students and people who are learning today. We ask ourselves about what our motivation is, and they found three types of motivations: the mastery goals, performance approach, and performance avoidance. If you have mastery goals, you like learning the material just for the sake of learning. It's possible you could have different experiences in different areas, right? I've taken classes where it was like, well, I have to learn this stuff. And I've also taken classes where I was like, wow, I want to learn this stuff and I want to read more about these topics, you know, that go beyond the material for the course. Performance approach is you want to do well, right? The grades themselves have that value. And performance avoidance is just trying not to fail. I've met students who acknowledge that they are learning because they were told you have to go to college, right? And that's just the rule. And so it's like, all right, well, I guess I'll do this, but I just want to get by. Well, how our motivation is influences how we do and how we care and our enjoyment. For instance, what Elliot and Chess found was that the people with the high mastery goals enjoyed things the most, but the people with the performance avoidance enjoyed things the least, right? The people who were there just because they had to be. That totally makes sense. But when we think about how is our attitude and commitment affecting our appreciation, that's a pretty big deal. The highest grades were interestingly not the mastery people, but the performance approach people. Like if grades matter to you, you're going to do well. But the people with the lowest grades were not surprisingly the people who had the high performance avoidance and low mastery, low performance approach. Well, motivation comes in a couple of different flavors, right? We've got intrinsic and extrinsic. So the question is, why are you doing things? Well, are you motivated by the nature of the activity? Is there something joyful about it for you? Do you like doing it just because you like doing it? Or are you doing it for extrinsic reasons, because you have to, or because of recognition? Um, if you're bribing a child to do homework, that creates extrinsic motivation versus a child loving the work or being interested or excited. Do children see you doing these things, doing work because you find it interesting, or do they see you doing it as a slog, something that you have to do? They're going to pick up on those and certainly develop their own motivations. But one of the difficult things to do is to help people to develop the intrinsic motivations, because they're going to do better. They're going to enjoy it more. And when the extrinsic motivations go away, people don't do those things. So look at how praise works, right? We ask ourselves, is praise a good motivator? And the answer is maybe. Well, what's being praised? For a long time, it was believed that you should praise children, just praise them, tell them that they're great. The problem is this creates, if anything, extrinsic motivation and can really cause problems. So if you praise, for instance, ability instead of effort, it encourages the development of fixed mindset, because if you're not good at something, don't bother. But if you praise the effort, it can increase the development of growth mindset, because you say, hey, effort's a good thing. I worked hard. I've accomplished something. Plus, if you're praising only ability, then the ability itself becomes the thing. And that's not particularly useful. How do we build those abilities? Whatever we work on gets better. So sometimes, that can be I guess, useful. A child might be really good at perhaps a sport or an activity, or might have some natural art ability, and they receive a lot of praise for whatever it is they're doing. But praising the ability can ruin the joy, right? Rather than praising the work, because then it's just something that you are, not something that you do. Um, Praise should imply standards. It should not compare the child to others, and it should be sincere. There's a Korean word, umchina, which is kind of a universal experience. It basically means my mother's friend's son. And I think a lot of people have this experience where these comparisons are made, like, why can't you be like so and so, because they do this? Very demoralizing and completely unhelpful, and yet a very big part of culture, to the point where, I've seen people kind of joke about it, where it's like, oh yeah, that's just how it is. So that these things can undermine this intrinsic motivation. When we think about motivation, we think about what we love and motivate us on our own. So perhaps you love, dancing, or playing a sport, or drawing, or writing. What would happen if you were paid to do it? Think of video games. People like playing games, but what would happen if you were paid to do it? Well, it turns out that if you expect an extrinsic reward, intrinsic motivation decreases, right? We're then doing something because we have to. And the things that we have joy for can be lost. I've said to people, I've heard this, find your passion. And yet I find that that's dangerous, because not everyone can find something. If you have a passion and it's what you want to do and you'll be paid for it, and it's a good career, awesome. But if you don't, just find something you like doing, something that you can wake up and get some enjoyment or intrinsic motivation to do, that you don't end the day hating it, right? And that's fine. And then you have the ability to do things that you enjoy on your spare time, the other things that you can kind of find. You don't have to find like this one thing that's your purpose. You can kind of work toward this and find things that you enjoy. When we look at the influences on behavior, we go back to some really early stuff with James's instinct theory. We have these instinctual things that are automatic, compared to drive theory, which isn't quite the same thing, because this has to do with maintaining our body's homeostasis and the what we think of as the optimal arousal level, basically between boredom and anxiety. And I'll explain how this works, but basically think of it like this, right? When you are studying, do you want to be in perhaps a coffee, coffee shop where there's a little bit of noise and a lot of people studying, a library that's very quiet and people studying, somewhere maybe more noisy, somewhere outside? Where do you want to be? Well, that's going to say a lot about your optimal level of arousal. Now, let me ask you a question. I'm going to show you two pictures. I'm going to ask you, there's 20 little circles, right, that represent people. So it's just kind of like a rough sketch idea. But I'm going to show you two images, A and B, and I'm going to ask you, which one do you think will benefit learning the most? Here's A. There's 20 desks in a traditional small classroom and 20 people in those desks. In B, there's 40 desks and 20 people spread out in the room. Which would be more optimal toward learning, A or B? Well, it turns out that most research and most people perform better in A. And this has to do with the very presence of others. When you are around other people, your heart rate increases and you are more aware. There's something called evaluation anxiety, right? We're actually, because we're concerned about other people's judgment of us, our performance goes up. in most things. So when you think about what benefits us, it actually turns out that we're going to do better. Taking a test by yourself can actually, for some people, is important, a reduced distraction environment, but for most people, taking a test in a crowded room is actually motivating. It actually helps us. And this goes back to Yerkes Dodson, where they found that for most things, the optimal level of arousal is somewhere of some moderate level, right? We don't want low arousal. And you think about how you are by yourself, just kind of like laid out on the couch, just kind of like whatever, when you're by yourself compared to when you're around other people and you're kind of self-monitoring a little more, right? Your performance is enhanced. So in a way, it's like hacking our own homeostasis physiology in order to improve our performance. Now, what's also part of this is for people who are really good at things, they want a high level of arousal. So think of like a professional athlete performing in a empty, empty gym compared to a crowded arena, right? The arousal level for someone who's really good at something will increase. But if you're not good at it, if you're just kind of like maybe you're an average or poor basketball player, when there's a little competition with one or two people, you might be at your best. But if you were like suddenly the center of attention with, many, many people watching, your performance might be hindered by that. So the idea is the presence of others improves performance when the task is simple and when you're an expert. But after a certain point, after this optimal level, it hinders when you're not good at the activity or it's a difficult task. And so this, presence of others increases arousal. And so you have your optimal level, right? We're unsatisfied with too little or too much stimulation. In fact, some people are overstimulated more easily, and being around a lot of people can be overwhelming. Other people are very understimulated and need to be around other people in order to raise their level of arousal. It's not one size fits all, but looking at your own performance and your own physiological needs can improve our ability to accomplish. So we have different needs and expectations, and we ask, how are your beliefs about your abilities? Are your needs met? And how do emotions work? Well, let's try to answer these questions. We start with the concept of self-efficacy. You are familiar with self-esteem, right? How you feel about yourself. But self-efficacy is about how you feel about your abilities. Specifically, are you competent to complete a task, right? Bandura from the Bobo doll study, he talks about the expectations about the consequences of our behavior, right? Motivation derives from these expectations. And we have these drives, these motives, these ambitions, the need for achievement, right? To accomplish things, the need for affiliation, to be around people. So the self-efficacy is how competent you feel you are. And you certainly are guessing right now that the more competent you feel you are, the better you're going to perform in things like your classes. Because if you feel that you have the ability to successfully do things, you're going to do well compared to if you feel that you don't, that you aren't going to do as well. Self-efficacy shows us, hey, I know what I need to do well. Then we think about our needs, right? And these drives to accomplish these things. And this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and there's some misunderstanding about it, right? It's not really a pyramid. It's more, we need to feel all these things to feel complete, right? And self-actualization is, we see it as a peak, like, oh, we need to get there. But it's simply one component of it, and I guess we think of it as kind of maybe tying things together, but the physiological means we need to have our needs met, right, in terms of food, and the basic necessities, even things, something like the sex, right, is part of that physiological need. Safety, you want to be living somewhere where you're not at fear for your life. Love and belonging, family, relationships. Esteem, you need to feel good about yourself, some kind of value. You could put self-efficacy in here too. And then self-actualization would be, are we being challenged? Do we feel this sense of purpose? Do you have interesting ways to express your creativity? And I've seen one more layer to the pyramid added because, my goodness, even people who have no home, who are, have very little, got to have that Wi-Fi and the ability to connect. Well, now let's look at the famous Schachter and Singer study. When we look at things and how we uh, understand emotion, because we don't understand emotion that well. We don't understand that our responses to things will change based on the situation, for instance. So consider on two bridges, one is a solid, bridge that's not swaying in the breeze. The other one is a suspension bridge that moves as you walk on it. And an attractive woman is standing toward the center of each of these bridges. And as a man passes her, she asks him to complete a survey. In the survey, the man is asked to give information on, she says it's a survey about being in nature and the influence of nature. And the man is asked to write a story about a picture. And in this story, the picture is just kind of a vague picture of a woman. And so the man might write stories that have like an emotional component to what she's doing or not. And so at the end of this, she hands them writes her number on a strip of paper, says, "Hey, here's the hotel, my number where I'm going to be staying, in my room. Here's the number. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to follow up with you." Well, they then looked at how many men contacted her based on the swaying bridge or based on the steady bridge. And they also looked at the emotional components of the stories that the men wrote to describe the picture. And you're not going to be surprised by this. But why did the men on the swaying suspension bridge, why were they more likely to put emotional components and reasons for the image? And why were they more likely to call the woman to follow up? The belief is that the physiological fear response was then relabeled as attraction. And so they had an enhanced attraction to this woman, and that increased their desire to follow up with her. When we look at theories of how emotion works, right, you have a fear stimulus and an emotion. Well, what causes this? The earliest theory is probably the most fascinating. This is the James Lange theory. William James was writing about it in 1890. And what's cool about it is it's counterintuitive. Basically, it's the arousal causes the physiology, and then we label it based on the situation. This would also fit for what happened on the bridge, but that would be more the Schachter and Singer 2 factor, where you have the heart pounding and the cognitive label, but we can still relabel this based on the situation. And then the Cannon-Bard arousal leads to both of the physiological and the emotion. And so the key is for the James Lange, you're labeling the cognitive after. For the others, we're labeling the cognitive at the same time. And so for the James, it was physiology first, physiological response. And there's been experiments with this where they would inject people with adrenaline and not tell them it was adrenaline. Like, oh, we're going to give you some vitamins, back when you could do insane things in psychology. And then they would put them in a room with either a pleasant person or an annoying person. And the person would either have an enhanced pleasant experience or an angry experience with this increased heart rate, because adrenaline would increase the heart rate. So they were labeling the emotion based on the situation. In the same way, you can hack yourself, you can hack your physiology to improve your public speaking. Are you afraid of public speaking? Many people are. Many people rate it as frightening as death. And yet, what it actually you can do is, if you were to say, I'm excited. Just tell yourself over and over, I'm excited. You can relabel that heart pounding as excitement from fear. Now, this is not easy to do. Not everyone can do it right away. But it's about, can we take charge of our physiological, relabel it, and then use that, right, to then state, hey, I'm not scared, I'm excited. In the suspension bridge study, what was the independent variable? Remember, the independent variable is, what is the experimenter manipulating? And your options are men, whether or not they called, the type of the story they wrote, or the type of bridge. And the answer is the type of bridge. The independent variable, there were two conditions. This represents the conditions. What was the dependent variable? Well, in this case, your same options, but two of these answers are correct. And they are whether or not the men called to follow up and the type of story they wrote. Because remember, they looked at the emotional response based on the type of story and based on the attraction, whether or not they called. Well, we can change fear responses in the same way I said, hey, maybe you can kind of change by relabeling your response to public speaking. Watson trained an infant who showed little fear to fear white things through classical conditioning by pairing a white rat, which the infant showed no fear to, with a loud clang that made the infant cry. So they found something the infant didn't like. The loud clang made the infant cry, and whenever now this little rat was present, they made the clang and the infant would, well, cry. This sounds pretty terrible, and it showed exactly what was expected, which was conditioning. Watson was also famous for saying, I can turn a child into anything. You through conditioning, I can create whatever kind of outcome, success or failure, law abider or criminal. When we look at how these things are, we have in our impulse system, right, our limbic system impulses, various nuclei. And what we're looking at here is the amygdala. You see the amygdala here? It's connected very closely to the hypothalamus, which is involved in hormones, and the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. And so it makes sense that certain memories are stronger for us than others based on these connections. So what happens if a human loses their amygdala, right? Amygdalas on both sides of the brain. Well, they did this with monkeys. They removed large portions of the temporal lobe, including the amygdala, and they found that by removing them alone, you could get the same response. Abnormal reactions to the environment, including reduced fear and sex with inanimate objects. They would also eat non-food items. They had what's called psychic blindness, which disconnects between the sensory properties and affective properties of an object. It's kind of like if you see a picture of a gun, you would be like, that's a gun, versus somebody pointing one at you, which would be, well, frightening. However, psychic blindness means the act, the affective property of the situation would be less interesting. You would simply see, oh, there's something here. Same thing with a snake. The monkey would know what a snake does, but would not have the natural fear that they have of it. Well, in humans, losing both of your amygdala would do the similar things. You would no longer detect averse emotional cues and stimuli. The quavering voice, an angry voice, the difficulty identifying fearful facial expressions, overly trusting, which can basically lead to you being taken advantage of, and interestingly, no longer recognizing scary music. We are aware that certain things sound scary. Now, how good are you at tracking your, internal kind of environment? How good are you at tracking how you feel? The term here is interoception. Interoception is the ability to perceive the internal state of the body, self-monitoring. So interoception, internal state, both for physical and emotional. For instance, we have areas in this insula that are active for disgust for both like the bad food disgust and for moral disgust. Certainly it makes sense that we would kind of use areas that are here. And the insula is this kind of reddish checkered area in the middle. It's not visible from the surface of the brain. You'll notice they had to cut out a portion of the frontal lobe and the top of the temporal lobe in order to see this insula. It looks like the surface of the brain, but it's inside that sylvian fissure. They ask you, look, do this now, right? And this is what the next experiment I'm going to show you is, can you monitor your own heartbeat? Can you feel your heartbeat? If you were to go silent, could you feel when it's beating? Well, they asked patients to do this and to see if a tone, they would then play tones, so it'd be like beep, beep, and you would say, was that tone in sync with your heartbeat or not? Did it match your heartbeat? Those who performed well had a larger, more active right insular area, showing this monitoring. This also is true for people good at monitoring their emotional state. If you say to someone, how do you feel? Do they have emotional granularity? Can they say, I feel maybe resentful over this situation, or I'm feeling nostalgic, for something that happened, in the past, versus I guess I feel happy, I guess I feel sad. The better you can identify, or I'm not really sure, I haven't thought about how I feel. The better you can identify this is related to health and mental well-being, and is also related to this activity. And like anything else, you can practice. You can look at what are some different emotional states, and is that how you are? Well, Freud had an instinct theory that we no longer believe, but the idea here is that we have this instinctive, aggressive energy that must be released in some way. It is no longer believed that people have instinctive, aggressive energy in the same way we don't believe that rebellion among adolescents is a necessity, right? It's simply cultural, right? There's other factors involved. Freud argued for something called catharsis, which was a nonviolent act that would drain us of aggression. So this could be something nonviolent, but it could also be something like watching violence. And it was believed that watching violence would actually reduce violence. So men should go watch, boxing or something that'll, really kind of drain their aggression. The problem is it doesn't work. And observational learning from Bandura showed us very clearly that watching violence doesn't drain violent impulses, but encourages them. All right, I'm going to show you some pictures. Can you identify the 7 emotions being experienced here based on the faces? Right? When you look at these faces, can you identify the emotions that they are experiencing? So pause, take a moment, and write them down. Well, here are the labels. Contempt is a fairly recent addition. The other 6 have been accepted far longer. But when we say universal emotions, what we mean is if we were to find a tribe somewhere that had no experience with our faces and our emotions, and we learned if we showed them pictures, they would identify these in their own language, and we could figure out what those were, right? That they could have each of these things would be a component. Now, there's far more expressions that we might be able to identify, but for this purpose, the 7, universal are here. Okay, so when we look at what this means is if you had trouble, for instance, with maybe identifying fear or surprise, perhaps you saw them as anger, or you had trouble figuring out which was which, it could be that you are simply young and your brain is still maturing. There are oftentimes 16, 17, even 18 or 19-year-olds who have difficulty identifying the emotions expressed in these faces because they are still developing. The limbic system matures in early puberty, but the frontal lobe, our impulse control, develops later. And if you have trouble identifying fear versus anger, if you identify fear as anger, you're going to respond inappropriately to a situation. And this could lead to misunderstanding and increased tension in that situation. Now, the next component to talk about is sex. Now, how do we get to sex when we talk about things like emotion? Well, the issue is we looked at what are things connected to. Well, the amygdala is this impulse system. It's near the hormones, right? What produces hormones. So how we define ourselves in terms of our sex and sexuality is a huge component of who we are and related to this and related to our emotions. And we also want to consider our cultural views on sex and sexuality. So we start with the history of our cultural views. In the United States, male homosexuality has long been viewed more negatively than female homosexuality, and still appears to be to a certain extent. In the early versions of the DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, which is used by therapists and psychiatrists for diagnosing psychiatric and psychological conditions, homosexuality was considered a condition. It was a treatable mental illness. If you think about, part of it made sense because homosexuality correlated and still does to a certain extent with certain mental health disorders. However, modern views see that it's not a mental health issue. It is sexual identity is not something that is a disorder or controllable, and the issues related to mental health are related to societal acceptance. So people who identify as a sexual minority but have a welcoming and supportive culture or in family, they don't have any more mental health issues than anybody else. So if we're being prejudicial against people based on these things, we're making their lives worse for no real reason other than our own prejudices. One of the big bombshells was from Kinsey, and he published a book called The Sexual Behavior of the Human Male. He had sent out a large number of surveys across the country and asked people to respond with information on their sex and identity and attitudes. And he argued that 46% of adult males had reacted sexually to both sexes as adults, that 37% had at least one homosexual experience as adults, and he estimated about 10% of the population was homosexual. He identified and developed the Kinsey scale that says that we are neither, that most of us are not on an extreme, but have some fluidity in our sexuality. Well, Kinsey, unfortunately, his study wasn't very good, but his impact was important. He lost funding. He caused a huge controversy, but it forced people to start to discuss sex and sexuality and brought it into the forefront from the shadows. For a long time, male homosexuals were considered to be degenerates, and forcing people to look at the prevalence did help. Now, Kinsey's numbers were high. Modern data looks more like this, where maybe about 3.5% of the population identifies LGBT, about 8.2% of the population admits some same-sexual behavior, 11% acknowledge some same-sex attraction, and this number is high, but over 100,000 Americans identify as transgender. And I'll look at some very specific numbers from the Kinsey Institute shortly that even go deeper than that. But what Kinsey did was helped people to learn things like both males and females masturbate, and it's not bad for you. It doesn't increase your probability of going blind, which they used to say was a thing. Homosexual acts are fairly common, and sexuality is not binary. So let's look at the way these things are defined. The basic typology is heterosexual and homosexual, but that's clearly missing out on things. Kinsey's continuum went from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual, with basically bisexual in between and different levels of that. What this also helps do is explains why in some cultures you see greater homosexuality than others. In a culture, in an area that is extremely accepting of homosexuality, you'll basically see people expressing their sexuality, who they are. So people maybe who are a 5 or even a 4 on the scale would probably engage in more homosexual experiences and identify that way, with people 3 feeling comfortable being, acting on bisexuality with who they're comfortable with. However, in cultures that are less accepting, you may see people who are 3s, 4s, and even 5s who can respond sexually to heterosexually, may live a heterosexual life while suppressing their homosexual attractions, often to their detriment, to their psychological detriment, because we can clearly see that somebody who is a 5 would much prefer to be in a heterosexual situation in most cases. In the same way that somebody who is, a 1 who is identified as heterosexual, but could occasionally find some homosexual situations to be attractive, would probably live a heterosexual life because that would be comfortable for them, and living a homosexual life would be missing out on a large component of their sexuality. Now, the last part is really interesting. This is the basically bidirectional, looking at the what we would think of as dimensions, where homoeroticism and heteroeroticism are orthogonal dimensions. This now allows us to put, okay, if you have high homoeroticism and high heteroeroticism, you would then be in the bisexual quadrant. If you had low for both, you might find yourself identifying as asexual. And then the traditional states that we talk about, right? Low homoeroticism, high heteroeroticism, might find yourself labeling as heterosexual. Now, here's some more data from the Kinsey Institute, and these are recent numbers. We look at things like age at first intercourse, what percent of the population identifies as homosexual. This is interesting. More males than females identify as homosexual, and yet more females than males reported having had some same-sex sexual contact. The median lifetime sex partners is lower than most people think. And when we think of what percent identifies bisexual, you see for males it's 1 to 3%, and for females it's 2 to 5%. So when you look at the LGBT numbers, we're seeing around 3 to 5% of the population identifying, in that, up to as high as maybe as 7%. When you look at attraction, now this is a decoupling of sexuality from attraction, right? And sexual identity and gender identity. People who identify as transgender aren't necessarily attracted to, one gender or the other. And you see here that there's a lot of bisexual type attraction for transgender people, and also low numbers of exclusivity. Female to male transgender people, many of them are attracted to males, and male to female transgender people, many of them are attracted to females, which kind of is surprising in many ways. When you look at asexuality, lacking sexual attraction or desire, the prevalence is about 0.5% to 1% of the population, and there's debate about whether it's an orientation or disorder. There are probably multiple causes, and it can occur with mood disorder or abuse history. So if somebody does identify as asexual, it might be useful to look at, is this their chosen orientation, or is there some other reasons for it? And yet at the same time, respect that asexuality is a legitimate and respectable orientation. We also ask, why do you see such a high prevalence of homosexuality in places like San Francisco and Seattle? Well, if you think of it, you see very low prevalences in some smaller cities and small towns. And it makes sense that if you are a minority for any reason, and in this case a sexual minority, you are going to be more likely to migrate somewhere where this is acceptable. So if you're born in San Francisco or Seattle and you are identifying as homosexual, then you're around a very diverse and supportive environment. But if you're born in, if you've ever driven through some of the plain states, and you see these huge areas of just nothing, and you pass through towns with populations of 1 or 200 people, it's much more difficult to find people like you in those environments. And so you see migration to these larger cities. When you look at the discrimination that LGBT people face, the discrimination is a reason for the greater risk of depression, drug use, and suicide. And acceptance is the protected against that. Origins of homosexuality aren't entirely clear, but there are some beliefs that, and some evidence for, that there are, everything, we believe everything has a reason, right, in terms of evolutionary pressures. And that can be, the adaptationist view. And it can be fraught because it's not necessarily how it works. We have things that appear simply as a result of something else, right? So you may have traits that we think were selected for, but are because of some other reason. Well, there is some evidence that, birth order could matter. Testosterone levels in the mother could matter. You look at twin studies, and twins have a higher likelihood of being homosexual if the other one is. There are some brain structural differences. So it's believed that there's some in utero hormonal pressures that can change this. In addition, when you look at the siblings of gay men specifically, oftentimes they will have increased fertility. So it's possible that some combination of genes is beneficial for reproduction, but certain other combinations would lead to homosexuality. And at the same time, culturally, historically, it was not necessarily seen as problematic because homosexual people would be integrated into daily life and could assist with raising the children of family members or other members of the tribe. So it's really quite complicated as to why, but we know that there are absolutely brain differences caused by early neurological organization. When we look at the biology, there's certain genetic differences, right? So when you look at the sex chromosomes, right, females have 2 X chromosomes and males have 2 Y. If you have an extra X chromosome, for a female, that's usually not a problem. For a male, that could be a possibility of having a feminized body. For having only a single X chromosome, a female with this case would probably not go through puberty and probably be infertile. A male with only a Y chromosome would be non-viable and spontaneously aborted. The reason is the X chromosome carries far more genes. Now, we look at what happens in terms of these and hormones. So you can have, for instance, people born with biological sex characteristics that don't fit the standard definitions of male and female bodies. These would not be called transsexual. These would be people who would be considered intersex. So somebody who is an XY chromosomally, right, which would be considered male chromosomally, could have something called androgen insensitivity, which means male hormones like androgens, which include testosterone, cannot enter into the cell during early organization. This can lead to feminization of the brain and will lead to generally feminization of the sex organs. So somebody with androgen insensitivity could appear to have, a vagina and other female sex characteristics. So they would appear completely female. And there's been cases of this, Olympians, right, who have XY androgen sensitivity, and there was debate about whether they should be allowed to compete because genetically what their genes were. You can also have the case of XX, what we call congenital adrenal hypoplasia, which the person is female but has masculinized sexual behavior and genitals, enlarged clitoris, for instance. perhaps a smaller vaginal opening. People like this may be more likely to identify as a homosexual. You also have 5-alpha reductase, which these people, due to their hormones, are born, they have a masculinized brain, but a feminized body. And they literally masculinize at puberty. Their penis grows, their testicles drop, and they end up with a masculine body from having had a feminine body. About 1% of boys in Salinas, in the Dominican Republic, have this, and it's so common that it's not really considered to be an issue. It's just something that happens, and most of these people will identify as male after going through puberty, right? So they're identified as female beforehand, they go through puberty, and they literally have this change. Well, intersex people are people with non-standard genitalia. And what's really interesting is, one, there's a lot of variability in what external genitals should look like. In fact, there's one of the damaging things, we think of as, we don't want to think of as porn as like porn bad, but one of the things that can be a problem is that they tend to have a standardized genitalia, which means that people who watch this may often think, oh, there's something wrong with me because I don't look like that. And people will have surgery to, correct something that is not necessarily to be corrected. Up to 1 in 60 people may be intersex, may have some degree of genital atypicality. These numbers are very hard to track, and because it's extremely private. In fact, up to 1 in 2,000 births, the genitals are noticeably atypical. Often, surgical intervention will happen and a sex is assigned at birth. Traditionally, this was female because that was easier. But now there's debate about what to do, to wait or not. When you look at, intersexuality and people with what we would think of as like non-standard genitalia, it's really hard because the greater this degree of atypicality, the harder it is to integrate. Relationships are hard enough, and sexual experiences are hard enough without going into a situation. And I think that ideally we would have a culture that would be accepting of, and liking people for who they were, and accepting differences. And yet I'm not sure that that we're near that state. When we consider the early influence of hormones and organization, we have to talk about the case of David Reimer. David was born Bruce, and during his circumcision, his penis was burned off. Now, how that happened is just baffling, but they were using a machine that you plugged in to do the circumcision, and it went horribly bad. So his parents saw Dr. John Money talking about transsexuality, and they contacted him, and this guy was just the worst, and he convinced his parents to castrate him and raise him as Brenda. He had a twin brother, and so basically they raised them together, and they tried to condition David to be Brenda. Dr. Money reported the transition was successful, and yet David never felt comfortable as Brenda. He eventually transitioned back to male, and took the name, born Bruce, was changed to Brenda, and then took the name David. At one point, he had gotten married, had a stepchild that didn't work out. The experience was extremely traumatic. Some of Dr. Money's methods would be considered wildly abusive. And unfortunately, David killed himself some years ago. Again, it's a lack of understanding, a lack of support, and this attempt to force somebody whose brain didn't match their body into a different body, and to keep telling them that they were wrong. And that's the idea of when we think of transsexuality. Now, David Reimer was not, would not identify as trans, because David went through this horrible situation, right? And would always have psychologically identified as male. But when you think about transgender people, how difficult this is to have a brain that does not match your body. And the belief is, and the evidence shows, that what actually happens for people who are transgender is their brain organizes in utero in a way that doesn't match their physiology. This is Lana Wachowski, one of my favorite directors, who co-wrote and co-directed The Matrix, along with other things, and identifies as transgender, very open about it. And when you look at these, the kind of influence of how these things are, once you see that she's, identifying, a woman, you can kind of go back and look at in the art, and see that this was kind of always present. There's approximately 100,000 Americans who identify as transgender, about 0.3% of the population. So that's about, 3 in 1,000. So there are certainly, in a place like Irvine Valley College, where you have thousands of students, a number of people who identify as transgender. And we look at the relationship between biological sex and gender identity. We know that most people identify with their physiological gender, but not everybody does. You cannot force somebody to identify as a gender that doesn't fit them. We saw that with the case of David Reimer. We saw that hormones have this early organizing effect on brain organization. And gender identity is how a person feels rather than how they appear. Another big step in sex and our understanding of sexual behavior was Masters and Johnson. Masters and Johnson had a fantastic study in the 60s where, completely freaked people out by studying sex, literally bringing people into the lab, hooking them up to machines that measured their physiological responses, and then had them do things like engage in viewing pornography, masturbation, having sex. And they measured things that were not studied before. The male and female sexual responses, going through these stages, the excitement, plateau, orgasmic, and the resolution stages, which they saw were different for males and females, where females could go directly from, orgasm very quickly back into another excitement stage, right? Back to arousal, where males would have this much longer refractory period post-orgasm before they could generally return to this state. So very interesting stuff, extremely controversial, because everything in this country that has to do with sex is going to be controversial. We saw Kinsey, we see Masters and Johnson. We saw other examples earlier. We talked about ethical research and how studies of sex and sexuality and sexual behavior are quite fraught. When we look at hormones in animals, we see that, for most animals, they're only receptive to sex during ovulation, right? When the female is around the periovulatory period, able to conceive. But for humans, females do have greater sexual interest during this period. Oftentimes, it's believed they find masculine and socially dominant men more attractive, but only at this time. Right? It's not the men they necessarily want to marry or be in a long-term relationship with, but they do see this attraction. And we are more attracted to those with different immune system genes because we, this kind of like subconscious, maybe pheromone or hormonal detection of what we're actually looking for. What population percent identifies as LGBT? Well, this one is actually about the lower number. It's the 3.5. Kinsey argued for the 10, but it's actually the 3.5. And so we should have a general idea now of our components of sexual behavior, emotion, motivation. And when we talk about our next segment, we're going to talk more about kind of motivation and how things influence personality. I hope you've enjoyed our talk about emotion, and I look forward to future discussions with you. Thank you.